So I'd just like to start off with an acknowledgement of country. Here in Melbourne, we are on the lands of the Wurundjeri people, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past and present. And for those of you joining from anywhere around Australia, I'd like to remind us all that we are living on Aboriginal land, and it always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So the events that we've run throughout the year, for those of you who have been to them before, and for those of you coming to the event today for the first time, they're put on by our wonderful council for this year, which are all presented here. If you're interested in following any of us, we've got some Twitter handles in there as well. But I'd like to put a big shout out to the council for this year. We've been a great team. We've put on a lot of really great events. So I'm really grateful for everybody's help this year. I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Ben, pictured here, Vice President for this year. And yeah, I'll be hosting tonight, and I co-organised this event with Cameron Patrick, who you can see on the top right there. So we are seeking expressions of interest for joining next year's council. So if you are a member of the SSA and you're interested in contributing to the running of events, you've got ideas for things that you'd like to see implemented, you just generally want to help out because you're a very altruistic and lovely person, you're welcome to reach out to any of us about joining the council for next year to help with us putting on another schedule of events for 2023. So one of the other things that you can do if you're a lovely and altruistic person is purchase one of our Great Australian Statisticians t-shirts, and the proceeds from the sale of these t-shirts goes towards the Early Career and Student Statisticians funding pool. So it's going to a good cause. T-shirt was designed by me. Fun fact. Even if you're not going to buy one, I'd suggest going and checking it out. They are really interesting, the statisticians on the back of the list. I don't know if any of you happened to listen to the Random Sample podcast recently with the national branch, or the national president and vice president, Ian Gordon and Jess Kaiser, but they made a comment about how Australia punches above its weight in terms of contributions to the field of statistics nationally. And someone's drawing on the screen. Let's turn that off. Yeah. Thank you for the reminder, whoever that was, that you can currently draw on the screen. Well, we don't want that happening. Yeah, my encouragement was to go and read about the statisticians that are listed on the t-shirt. They're all very interesting and have contributed in lots of different ways to the field of statistics. And there's a few socials on the left there if you want to keep up to date on what we're doing. And current things that we are doing, we do still have funding on offer for our members. So if you are a member of the SSA that lives in Victoria or Tasmania, you can apply for up to $200 of funding to attend workshops and other statistical related things. You can check out the link on the screen there. And if you do want to review these slides at a later point, you can see them at the link at the bottom of the screen in the little blue tab. If you're considering membership, it's a good deal. For students, it's only $20 and you're eligible to get up to $200 of funding. So that immediately pays for itself. But even if you're applying for full membership, it's still a really good deal. Now, another item of interest for everyone is that we are currently still accepting applications or submissions for the 2022 Die Cook Award, which is our open source statistical software award. And this is for graduates or recent graduates or current students of Victorian and Tasmanian tertiary institutes. So yeah, submissions are closing on Friday the 25th of November, and we'll announce the winner in 2023 at the AGM in the main event, and they'll win $1,000, which is pretty good. Now, if you have any questions as we go along today, we will be accepting written questions in the SSA community Slack, which you can join by following the link on the screen. At the end of the talk tonight, we will allow people to unmute themselves to ask questions directly to Kalinda. But if you have any questions as you're going along, you feel free to pop them in the top level thread in our Slack channel.
In #Vic Events.
Yes, in the Vic Events channel. Thanks, Cam. Now, I'll just do a quick introduction for Kalinda, who we've all come to hear from tonight. And I'm very excited to hear this talk. I'd like to apologise on behalf of Victoria for our cold weather. Kalinda's come down from the Northern Territory where it's lovely and warm to Victoria, where we are having our coldest 4-day period in November in 167 years. It's awfully cold. So sorry about that, but welcome. If you're not familiar with Kalinda, she's a Yawuru woman of Broome, born and living in Darwin. She has a number of roles, including the Scientia Senior Lecturer at the Centre for Big Data Research in Health and Research and Education Lead at the Victorian Comprehensive Cancer Centre Alliance. Her research and work addresses the quality and governance of Indigenous data with a focus on equity, the measurement of health disparities, improving health services and outcomes, as well as building health research capability in regional and remote Australia. She holds honorary fellowships at the University of Melbourne and Menzies School of Health Research, and is also Deputy Editor of the Health Promotion Journal of Australia. She sits on a number of international and national committees, including the International Group for Indigenous Health Measurement, the Australian Bureau of Statistics, the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, and the National Indigenous Australians Agency, among others. That's quite an impressive list, even just those. Kalinda has also won a number of awards. Notably, she's been the Young Australian of the Year for the Northern Territory, was the 2019 Lowitja Institute Emerging Researcher winner, as well as the 2019 Science and Technology Superstar of STEM. And a little fun fact, which cleared up some of our communication, was that Kalinda's favourite animal is the duck. I think we're quite a good choice. My favourite thing about ducks is that when they quack, it sounds like they're laughing, and that brings me joy. But anyway, without further ado, I'll let Kalinda take the reins, and I'll just get the slides up.
Thank you.
Take it away.
Thank you, Ben. So just a big thank you to Ben and also to Cameron for the invitation to be here today to talk to you guys about data and information. I am going to buy one of those shirts as well, just so you know. I love that. And I will apologise for my voice as well. I was singing on the weekend and it's a little bit croaky because of that. And nowhere in particular, just at home, destroying my relationship with my neighbours. So before we begin, I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional custodians of the lands on which we're meeting here today, the Wurundjeri people. I'd like to pay my respects to all elders, those of the past, the present and the future. And I'd also like to acknowledge other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here and online today. So, Naya Nilawa Kalinda Griffiths, Nilawa Corpus, Naya Jandu, Janu Buru Bibi. My name is Kalinda Griffiths. I am a proud Yawuru woman. My family name is Corpus. And my country is in Broome in Western Australia. I also live and work on Larrakia country in the Northern Territory, just so that you get some positionality of where I'm from and who I am. I'm also an epidemiologist at the Centre for Big Data Research and Health at the University of New South Wales, where I work on, I guess, using existing population level data to better understand why some populations are healthier than others. I hold a number of other roles too. I won't go into those. You can see them on the screen. But I work across a range of programs and projects, and my interest is in the usability of existing data and big linkage data for the purposes of research and community development. So I'm particularly interested in the quality of the data being used and what we're measuring and also how we're measuring it. And now if we're talking about data in an official capacity, this raises a number of questions for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And this includes what data is out there, who owns the data, what does it mean for us as individuals and communities as well, and how we're able to use that data. So full disclosure, I really love data and I'll keep pitching that. And I do identify as a data nerd. I do like seeing patterns and watching trends emerge. And to me, data is like art, and it's one of the many ways to visualize the complex world around us. I also love it because it can be an incredibly useful tool in challenging health disparities. I see data as one of our most critical and powerful tools in advocating for change and making that positive change in society as well. However, data utilisation for the purposes of disparity measurement is actually not for the faint-hearted. It bridges the worlds of the analytical, the social, and the cultural. And although data is often described as this sort of magic pill and fix it all, it actually isn't. It isn't easy to get your hands on. It's not inexpensive either. It's hard to use, and it only tells but one story at a time. So to do it well, it requires that those who undertake the work realise and respect its historical and contemporary contexts as well, and also have enough analytical knowledge and expertise about the methods and the statistics used to explain what the data is saying within those contexts. So really quite critical on that. But as we know, nothing in love is ever straightforward, and there are a number of things that do require our attention and our consideration when it comes to the collection and use of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander data, particularly for the use of official statistics and for reporting at that national level. Just want to see how that's popping up there. Yeah, cool. So on that note, I wanted to talk to you today about 4 main discussion points that my work and my work with others has focused on. And this includes rights, recognition and identity, particularly regarding how Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are recognised within their member states and where this fits within a human rights framework. The power of data in supporting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander priorities and nation building regarding the role of data of the data ecosystem and with inequity, and then also issues in the measurement and reporting of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples with a focus on the quality of national data. As well. And I also wanted to discuss some of the work we've done in how we can reconcile sort of some of these hegemonic issues that we're going to go through and the needs of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples through sovereignty and governance as well. I do want to preface a couple of things though. Firstly, that I use the term disparity purposefully. I use it because it highlights an implicit assumption that the differences between different populations can be due to social injustices, so an inequity, and not simply a variation in equivalence between 2 groups, so an inequality. And this is an important term because it describes some of those embedded systemic issues that society has, as well as those things that we can't really account for when we think about statistics and measurement. I also use the terms Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and Indigenous peoples, and I primarily use the term Indigenous peoples in an international context as well. So you'll hear me jumping between those terms. Before we get into it though, I want to provide the story about how this work kind of came about. So back in 2019, we published a review on measuring Indigenous identification. It was one of 9 articles from 5 nations discussing the identification of Indigenous peoples in their countries or in their respective nations. The countries included Australia, New Zealand, Aotearoa, Canada, the United States and Brazil. And it arose from a number of global meetings over, probably about 10 years with members of the International Group for Indigenous Health Measurement and people working in official statistics, governments and international agencies as well. Several of us were invited to present to the International Association of Official Statistics and the OECD nations in Paris back in September 2017, or sorry, this is 2016 publication. And we wanted to put a spotlight on Indigenous identification as the critical aspect collected about Indigenous peoples. So importantly, previous meetings about how to measure Indigenous health and the impact of colonisation upon health had highlighted this known invisibility of Indigenous peoples in official data collections, and the result of which placed a global effort, an advocated call to improve Indigenous data around the world. And we have published on that as well. This raised further discussion about how Indigenous peoples are counted and by whom, how are human rights met with regards to the right to be counted as Indigenous peoples, as well as highlighting the quality of the information used to report on Indigenous peoples. So we decided to describe some of those critical issues arising, I guess, and from capturing Indigenous peoples within official statistics. So what were some of the critical issues that we found? Well, there were 3 overarching international issues. Firstly, who is counted, which includes considerations regarding the definitions of indigeneity and the operationalisation of those definitions, as well as the propensity for individuals to identify. Secondly was how many people are counted. This included issues with the completeness of the coverage and the accuracy of enumeration of the counts, as well as methodologies used by national statistical agencies to address issues of over and under counts. And thirdly, what is counted and measured? And this involves thinking about the development of indicators and measures, I guess, that encompass Indigenous people's states of events, values, and understandings. In Australia, we found that we needed to discuss the impact of Australia's colonial history, which includes our identity and any variation of identity across different nations, and what that actually means for reporting. We also needed to unpick and further discuss some of the contemporary issues, such as rights and recognition, when identifying Aboriginal people, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the data. And lastly, we need to discuss the data collections that are held, the data issues when used in the reporting of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and those different measurement approaches that can be used. So very similar to those international ones. And this all requires an understanding of our state and territory, national population level data sets, and the ins and outs of their use as well. So people have the right to recognition and the right to be counted. And when it comes to official statistics, individual and collective rights to citizenship in Australia can only be met with accurate identification, accurate counts in the data collected about us. This is for all people in Australia, not just for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as well. Recognition for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, however, is embedded in our right to self-determination. And so let's have a bit of a chat about human rights. So okay, did a double tap. Yes. So the identification of Indigenous people in regards to international human rights has been discussed since the early 1980s. In terms of a timeline of the development of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, it was actually a really quite slow process. And these timelines provide a picture of the 37 years it took from the signing of the UN Charter in 1945 through to the establishment of the first formal working group on Indigenous populations in 1982. And this was within the UN Economic, within the UN Economic and Social Council. While Indigenous issues were being discussed within the human rights context, it was still another 25 years after that first working group meeting before the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was actually adopted. And there are a couple of critical articles within the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, as well as other human rights mechanisms that provide a bit of a blueprint for nations to discuss and incorporate Indigenous people's rights in the discussion of data and information collection as well. So the first is regarding the right to identify, where Article 33 states, Article 33 of the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, that is, states that Indigenous peoples have the right to determine their own identity or membership in accordance with their customs and their traditions. And it's clear that Article 33 highlights the requirement for self-determination in identification. It should also be noted that it purposefully does not specify a definition of Indigenous peoples. Article 15 states that Indigenous peoples have the right to dignity and diversity of their cultures, their traditions, their histories and aspirations, which shall be appropriately reflected in education and public information. This, along with the right to identify as Indigenous and our right to self-determination, actually provides that blueprint, that framework to guide what information is collected about us and for what purposes. In regards to managing expectations about what happens with that data, Indigenous data governance approaches underpinned by community-led Indigenous data sovereignty principles can be developed in programs and systems that collect information about us within our respective nations. So if data is to be used to tell our stories, our experiences, and we're going to be reported on, then we need to be at the table. And we as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples need to be aware that we have every right to do so. So the context of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander data is often a challenging one to have, but I think it's absolutely critical in better understanding this issue overarching. So most official data collected by governments on Indigenous peoples is developed within a colonial and racialised context. What this has resulted in is what we call coloniser sanctioned forms of recognition. What do I mean by this? Well, while the recognition of identity, so who we are, can be achieved by Indigenous peoples for Indigenous peoples, we need to be cognizant that the recognition of indigeneity within data has historically only ever been granted by governments. So as an example, the Australian government officially counted Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people from 1901 to 1967 for the sole purpose of excluding us from the national population count. The 1967 referendum resulted in changes to sections 51 and 127 of the Constitution. And it was this change to section 127 that resulted in the inclusion of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in the census. And this inclusion only arose from our nation's moral imperative to include and count Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people via a democratic vote. So further, it wasn't until 1978 that the Commonwealth definition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people was developed. And again, it wasn't until 1996 that the operationalisation of that definition, the standard Indigenous question, was actually officially implemented. These developments were done in partnership with community-controlled orgs and with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leadership and advice. However, the context in which it still occurs is this sort of power differential. So our starting position with data in Australia is within this power differential. Basically, we were allowed to be counted. So the generally accepted Commonwealth definition of Indigenous people in Australia was adopted by Federal Cabinet in 1978. And it states that an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander is a person of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander descent who identifies as an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander person and is accepted by such as the community in which he or she lives. So this definition has three well-known components, or prongs, as other people call them. Specifically, it's descent, self-identification, and community acceptance. They're pretty hard to capture in terms of developing up a standard Indigenous question. But the current standard Indigenous question was developed by the Australian Bureau of Statistics and adopted formally in 1995 and put into operationalisation in 1996. And the standard for identifying an individual as a member, it is the standard, sorry, for identifying an individual as a member of the Indigenous population in Australia. It includes two of the three components of the Commonwealth definition, and this includes descent and self-identification. Just as a note, this definition is quite ahead of other nations, both in terms of development and also in terms of capture. There is a lack of official, reliable statistics and information for Indigenous peoples across most regions and countries in the world. And so, again, I will note that this definition and the SIG was actually developed in partnership with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and I think that this is what made all of the difference in being able to step us ahead. And we didn't just step ahead, I think, prior to the, the developments that were occurring in terms of identity and identification across nations. It happened before those discussions were occurring as well. So I think that's something that we should be quite proud of. While it's a requirement for all government services to ask this question, when it comes to official statistics and reporting, there have been a range of challenges. So a New South Wales Ministry of Health report from several years ago, I think it was 2017, found that some of the challenges are ingrained in overt bias and assumptions made about individuals. So, for example, if the person asking the question assumes the individual is not an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, they don't ask the question at the service. Some of the other challenges include the propensity to identify for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, which has to do with how safe someone feels when they enter into a service as well. And this has to do with cultural competence and cultural safety. And some of it has to do with the service not routinely collecting data. So as an example, private pathology businesses are not regulated to ask the question. And you can kind of imagine how this played out during the COVID-19 pandemic as well. Not to say that that's over by any measure. So straight off the bat, we have quite well thought out definition, standard Indigenous question, which is part of the national minimum data sets. And for those who don't know, the national minimum data sets is the Australian government data sets that specifies the minimum set of data elements, which must be collected and reported across Australia. And then additionally, we are really well equipped in terms of systems and architecture to collect Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander data. but we actually don't do it as well as we would hope, or as well as we can. So Australia is a colonial nation that has resulted, I guess that has resulting tensions when it comes to First Nations peoples. There are ingrained biases, both individual and systemic, that have continued the narrative of the colonised and the coloniser. And this has far-reaching impact in regards to current day health, wellbeing, culture, economic positionality of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people generally. We know colonisation is bad for our health. I don't need to go through that here. There has been significant investment into the developments regarding how we better understand and address the health and social economic gaps experienced by First Nations people. And I think that, you know, we've come quite a long way, particularly over the last 20 years. But historically, the first regular collection for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander data, or of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander data, was by the Northern Territory Administration. And this was on infant mortality, and it was back in 1957. But it would be another 16 years in 1973 that before the Commonwealth and jurisdictional health ministers would endorse a policy of collecting national Aboriginal health statistics. So we've got quite a big gap there. And despite the 1967 referendum and also those changes to Section 157 in the Australian Constitution, which I'll remind you, where Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were to be included in the census every 5 years, no jurisdiction was actually actively counting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander births or deaths up until almost the mid-1980s. So part of the challenge in the reporting of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health and welfare has been that efforts have been patchy and sometimes reactive in this space. This has resulted in developments in lacking consistency over time. This has included efforts such as the joint Australian Bureau of Statistics and the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare unit in Darwin, which was established back in 1996. And this was to produce biennial publications on the health and welfare of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And it would only last 7 years before it was disbanded. Back in 1987, recommendation 49 arising from the Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody stated that the proposals for a special national survey covering a range of social, demographic, health and economic circumstances of the Aboriginal population with full Aboriginal participation at all levels be supported. The ABS, the Australian Bureau of Statistics, developed the first national Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander survey as a response to this. The purpose of the survey was to provide governments with a stronger information base for planning and empowering, or the planning for the empowerment of Australia's Indigenous peoples, and for measuring progress in meeting their objectives, aspirations and needs. Sorry, that's a quote. So while there have been a number of iterations of the Australian Bureau of Statistics Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander surveys, which still is in progress today, we've still got a couple running there, there is limited information on how the initial purpose of the development has actually worked to empower Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. We don't know. There has been a number of departments, centres, committees and groups who have focused on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander data and measurement over the years. Unfortunately, there has been limited government support for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander oversight in this. A notable example of this is the 2008 National Indigenous Reform Agreement and the initial Closing the Gap targets. There was extensive criticism regarding the development of the targets occurring without consultation with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. There has also been a range of criticism regarding the focus being on the needs of governments rather than the priorities and the aspirations of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and communities. Further, while measures of life expectancy and school attendance are important, there's also a need to ensure that summary measures reflect those things that matter to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. The Australian government now reports on the refresh targets, and while the Close the Gap refresh is still a number of criticisms, as most policies do, they were led and developed by and in consultation with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and peak bodies. It's a critical component there. So why are all these official statistics important? Well, data and information derived from data about us actually matters. In fact, I mean, in Australia, it matters so much that Commonwealth Bureau of Census and Statistics, which is now the ABS, and its subsequent legislation act was developed less than 5 years after federation. This means that the federal government prioritised the collection of data and information through the development of this independent regulatory body. They know that data holds power, data does hold power. Data matters because it tells us who needs what, where. It matters differently as well to different people, and it matters because we all have the right to be counted. We all have the right to be seen, regardless of our race, locality, our language. And if we aren't counted in the data, then to governments, we effectively don't exist. So let's go through the Australian data ecosystem. There are a range of data sets that can be used to measure and report. So each data set has its own purpose, which makes it quite unique. They all have limitations, quite major ones, and many of these data sets are not Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander specific. So they're a whole population or regional data, or jurisdictional, sorry. So some of the data sets are national, some are state territory, some are community controlled, and some are institutional as well. And they include census data, which most of you will know provides us with demographic profiles, meaning that we can assess rates by age, sex. We can also assess, I guess, intersecting issues like socio-economic status and geographic remoteness. One of the challenges that we've had is the use of Indigenous status as a proxy for disadvantage, and we often use remoteness as well as a proxy for Indigenous peoples. And we know that this is not the case. And so data can potentially be this tool in redressing this negative stereotyping for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, particularly that census data as well. So vital statistics, including births and deaths. And this can work to provide life tables that are important for life expectancy estimates and survival estimates as well. There are varying ranges of missing data or incomplete data on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and this results in bias and ultimately can result in inaccuracies in the reporting, and there is. Survey data such as the ABS, National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Health Survey, can provide context-specific cohort information. And I guess the exciting thing about survey development is that people can create their own domains of value, so what matters to people, and that can be created. Administrative data. This includes data that comes from hospitals, things like notifiable disease registries, primary healthcare, as well as community-controlled organisations. Administrative data gives us our information on things like people diagnosed with disease and who are accessing services like schools. Research data is collected for the purposes of research and usually provides answers to a specific question. But research data can also be stored. It can include biosamples and information in accordance with participants' consent. And each of these data sets are tended to by their individual data custodians in their different jurisdictions, regions, whatever it might be. Some of these data can be linked to each other, and there are important reasons for data linkage. But for me, I see its power in being able to move the discussion beyond the conventional indicators and onto our understanding, I guess, of health and wellbeing. It means we can use data to better understand and monitor those social determinants of health at that population level if we're collecting the right information. This is resulting in quite an important shift in the way in which we go about doing data business. And I guess that there's developments between governments, researchers, service providers and communities. And this is kind of how we're moving forward with data sharing. This way, for those of you who have used data, instead of getting a single data linkage set, there's opportunity to develop updating longitudinal data assets as well. And so we're seeing this sort of rolling ethical longitudinal data sets as well as we're moving on. And so there have also been major advances in the capability for governments to share data among themselves as well. And that includes to link that data. And I mean, this is one of the primary reasons for the ONDC, the Office of the National Data Commissioner. Although I would have personally liked to have seen it as an independent regulatory body, it was initially created within the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. It's now moved over to the Department of Finance. But yeah, there's a major role for the ONDC to play in terms of being able to share that data across governments. So just on the discussion about developing up our own indicators, the last several years, we've seen major advances in the considerations regarding the measurement of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health and wellbeing. And we've seen projects such as the What Matters study and the development of the Mike Y study. And these are led by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to provide tools to measure Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health and wellbeing. While they provide this culturally competent, evidence-based approach for addressing the social and cultural determinants of health and wellbeing of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, they're not supported as government programs, and they're actually reliant upon research funding for that external continuity. And so I think that it is obvious that there's a requirement for developments in data, information and measurement to support the health, social, cultural and economic aspirations of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And it needs to be driven by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And I do not mean doing this work alone. It's all hands on deck. I mean, realistically, it's not feasible for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to do this on our own. You know, we've got 3% of the entire population in this country. And so we do need all hands on deck. So I think one example of how we're moving forward with this is with the Indigenous Data Network. And so the Indigenous Data Network works to engage with and leverage internationally leading developments in the data sciences. And this is to maximise the collection, the access and use of data resources and community empowerment. And so the functions of the IDN, the Indigenous Data Network, include providing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities and organisations access to research expertise to facilitate their data priorities, to support access to data held by others, so that data sharing capability, and to build data capacity within Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities as well across Australia. Again, though, these developments often, while in partnership with government, sit outside of that funding round, so it's all reliant on that external for that continuity. Data is also incredibly important in regards to the reporting and provision of services for our mob. And so data is required or is used to describe and monitor the social, economic, health and wellbeing of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And this reporting occurs internationally, nationally, across state and territory jurisdictions, and it also occurs at that community level as well. And so our official reporting requirements includes meeting the requirements on existing agreements with the OECD nations, the UN. We've also got the National Indigenous Reform Agreement. We've got, you know, which is the COA closing the gap refresh stuff. And then we've also got a range of state and territory policies and frameworks that need to be met as well in terms of reporting. But the enumeration, the counts of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people isn't just necessary for these reporting and this reporting, it's also necessary for the allocation of population level funding and individual level services as well. So as an example, the Commonwealth Grants Commission, which allocates goods and services tax, uses measures of population growth, including changes in the census and those differences. And this is based on those ABS estimates of populations to allocate funds across regions. So as you probably all know, I won't go into this one here, but you know, there's been a 25% increase of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in the last census compared to the previous one. And that has been primarily around the east coast of Australia. So that goods and services tax allocation it gets taken from those regional remote areas and goes to that eastern coast. Yeah, so this can have quite a huge impact on these areas missing out. And also the Australian government requires Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to identify themselves to receive Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander specific services and programs as well. And so I guess that this is all overarched by the fact that Indigenous peoples have the right to be counted, and data plays an important role because Indigenous peoples have these health, economic, social, environmental and cultural rights that just can't be wholly addressed if there are inaccuracies in our reporting. So really important. So issues in the measurement and reporting of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. So just a quick example of the issues with the counts. This is the birth registration example. Some of you would have seen it before. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander births within a number of states and territories are critically underreported. We know that there's a large gap, a large number of births missing from the official statistics used for reporting purposes. And so to identify the issue with birth registration underestimations, two data sets are usually looked at. So we've got, one is the perinatal data collection, and this holds information about obstetrics, delivery, perinatal outcomes, and this data is collected from each state and territory from midwives and other staff who use information collected from mothers and hospital records. So in the hospital system, there we go. The second is the birth registration data collection, which is the information given to a state or territory registry of births, deaths and marriages. And this is usually by the parents after birth. The data capture by registries can vary by state and territory, and that can also impact consistency. But basically the legislation is the same. Trust me, I know, I've gone through every single one of the laws around this. Nationally, we know that there's almost 5% under registration of births when linked to the perinatal data collection. However, when this is looked at by Aboriginal status, rates increase to 17% and 18% under registration in Queensland and Western Australia, respectively. We haven't done the other states and territories. Furthermore, if this is looked at by remoteness, the proportion of under-registration of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander babies in remote and very remote areas is up to 23.4% and 27% for Queensland and WA again. So, pardon?
May I ask a question just to clarify? So basically, there are very under Indigenous Australian babies born as reported by hospitals. In remote and very remote areas of Western Australia, only 40, less than, that 73% of them are reported to the birth register.
Yes.
So rough, a quarter of it. Okay.
Yeah, so 1 out of every 4 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander babies born in remote and very remote areas don't exist. Yeah.
Yes, sorry. Just follow-up question. Birth at home is not counted, because I suppose that some may decide to give birth at home and so not under the body hospital.
They usually are counted, so they definitely go into the perinatal data collection.
Can we, because there's a lot of people attending online, just repeating that last question about births at home counted here, Kalinda?
Oh yeah, so births are counted. So they do. So a midwife has to attend to make sure that that baby is safe and everything else once baby is born, or during that birth. And so they are reported to the perinatal data collection, and then the parents will then register that birth to the registration.
But is there an estimate of the amount of babies born without intervention of midwife? When I meant birth as in,
I'm not sure. I'm not sure about if there is an underreport. I've no doubt that there would be.
We also had a question posted online asking, is the percentage of underreporting increasing over time?
We don't know, because we haven't got the routine reporting around this. And so again, this comes down to making sure that we have ongoing routine reporting for these issues that we are very aware of. So we don't know the answer to that.
Thanks, Kalinda.
Yeah. And so I think what this means is that any birth registrations used for the, or that's utilised for the purposes of official statistics is actually probably getting it wrong if they're using that data asset without linking it and making sure that those collections are enhanced. It's also why there have been different statistical methodologies when it comes to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander birth registrations data. So, for those things that we should be measuring, things like life expectancy estimates, it's quite a complicated procedure in the background of backcasting and a bunch of other things that we do at the national level as well. Basically, it complicates things a lot more these issues. But what do we do about it? Well, birth registrations enable the rights of citizenship to be enacted. Everything from a Medicare card to a passport is the result of having your birth registered. And this means working with registrars in states and territory jurisdictions to ensure that all of our babies are counted. In terms of official statistics, the good news is that with the move towards this data sharing with governments, we might be able to pick up those people that we miss out on through some of that data linkage. And also just to note, in Queensland, once they were aware of this issue, and this goes to that previous question of are these rates increasing over time, they ended up doing an audit across the state and have developed up a program to improve their birth registrations, particularly in regional and remote Queensland as well. So the registrar there has developed that. So just an example about that data linkage, a baby might not be registered at birth, but it might be picked up in GP data or education data. And this data could theoretically then be used to enhance those birth registration data, flag those people who are required to register to ensure birth certification. But it isn't just about handing over information about us. It's also about ensuring governments and official statistical agencies work for us as well. There are a range of limitations when it comes to the quality of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander data to be used for the purposes of cancer reporting. So I'm a cancer epidemiologist by trade, please don't hold that against me. But yeah, we did the first ever national, or semi-national, I should say, estimates for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cancer survival rates back in 2010, and we ended up publishing that in 2014. And it was in fact the first major national data asset that I trained on. So in over 12 years, we've still not seen any major improvements in the ability for national reporting of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cancer estimates as a whole. We're still only at semi-national. And you can see here that there are a couple of challenges with the National Cancer Database and the National Mortality Database, as well as the National Cervical Screening Program as well. So we need this data as well as the data for national cancer control indicators to ensure that we're able to better report on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cancer outcomes and needs, quite obviously. But you can kind of see that, yeah, there's a few in here that need a little bit more work. So this is a graph that shows the differences in mortality rates between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and non-Aboriginal people from the 2020 Closing the Gap report. And so the report commentary to this graph stated that there is a significant decline in mortality rates from 2006. Now, this data trend statement is a concern because it relies on the initial years of decline from about 2006 to 2009. I'm just going to skip across and you can kind of see it just up here, 2006 to 2009, just as a nice little dip there. And everyone who has ever played, or anyone who has ever played with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander data knows that the quality of mortality data is not able to be used for any sort of time trend reporting prior to 2010. So the fact that they've used that to develop up these trajectories is a bit of a slap. My point is this, methods matter as well. If we think about this in absolute terms, then the gap isn't closing. In fact, it appears to be getting wider. And we need a bit of a reality check when it comes to reporting processes when there are disparities. And I think if there are disparities, then there are disparities. We need to be talking about that. It means we work towards solutions instead of denying that issue exists, and we shouldn't be trying to reframe that. You know, if life expectancy estimates aren't decreasing, then we need to speak about why, and we need to move on from that. I also want to note that in the 2021 Closing the Gap report, age standardised mortality rates were not presented. So we've had discussions with the Productivity Commission as well as other government agencies around particularly this report, and gone into quite depth with those guys as well. So instead, within that 2021 report, there was a comment on child and infant mortality rates and a graph on age standardised avoidable mortality rates that were actually shown. I haven't had time to look at the 2022 report. So all of this is kind of existing out there. We know that there's limited reporting. There are a couple of issues around this. So I guess the question is how do we reconcile the hegemonic issues of data, or with data and the needs and aspirations of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples? Well, I don't exactly know. I don't have the answers here, but I do know that it starts with enacting those rights of Indigenous peoples in the collection, use, storage and measurement of data and information. So this is a timeline that we did from a review on identifying developments in rights in Indigenous data sovereignty over time. And the review was commissioned from the Lowitja Institute, went back to 1997 to align with the establishment of that organisation. And we found that there are a number of principles, issues and needs specific to Indigenous peoples that were explicitly described since 2004. And this is important because it provides us with some of the legwork and the information required to develop and implement Indigenous data sovereignty and governance into practice. So what is Indigenous data sovereignty? Well, it's been defined by Kufutai and Taylor as the inherent and inalienable rights and interests of Indigenous peoples relating to the collection, ownership and application of data about their people, lifeways and territories. Indigenous data sovereignty is a way to assert self-determination in the way in which we develop, control, maintain, protect and use data. It should be noted, however, that Indigenous data sovereignty is a conceptual term and it's theoretical by default. It's applied and practiced through Indigenous data governance processes. So in Australia, the Maimnari Wangara Collective, or the Australian Indigenous Data Sovereignty Collective, has developed overarching national principles that align with the international work that's been done since 2004. So I think if governance generally, or data governance generally, is about managing information in a way that's consistent with the laws, practices and customs of the nation state in which it's located, then where do these inherent and inalienable rights, I guess, and interests of Indigenous peoples fit? So this is where the power struggle kind of comes in. Well, that power differential that I spoke about earlier has resulted in limited structures that support Indigenous worldviews, values and understandings in societies. And so for me now, I see the time is for valorisation, and that is normalising value and supporting those Indigenous worldviews, practices and understandings within Western structures, within legal and regulatory frameworks that will facilitate the rights or ensuring the rights and interests of Indigenous peoples are met. So basically, Indigenous data governance that provides for collective representation of the needs of individuals and their communities. It's also worth noting here that Indigenous data governance can only be achieved by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. It's not the same, although it's related, to the governance of Indigenous data, which is a really important concept when we're working with government data. So how do we conceptualise this? To make this a little bit more transparent, we did do a couple of systematic reviews, one on operationalising Indigenous data sovereignty, and that was led by Skye Trudgett, one of my PhD students, and I led one on Indigenous data governance as well. And I won't go into all of this today, but basically there's a lot to think about. And we need to consider policies, processes, mechanisms across the 4 tiers of international, national, place-based and individual levels. This includes things from cultural authority action through Indigenous data governance through to institutional policies that are in alignment with legal and ethical frameworks, through to what is requested by individual or community consent as well, or signed off. It should also be noted that non-Indigenous people can't drive Indigenous data sovereignty as well. However, they can support developments in the governance of Indigenous data with recognition that they are very different things, just noting that again. But how do we put all of this into practice? So if that's around conceptualizing it and where it all kind of fits in the big ecosystem of the data world, well, within the Lowitja Institute, there was a recognised need to support the progress of Indigenous data sovereignty, and particularly Indigenous data sovereignty in practice. And so we ended up doing a review and were commissioned to do a bit of work about identifying potential innovations that could work to, I guess, move forward developments in Indigenous data sovereignty. And we came out from those reviews and that work with 4 primary ideas, and that included developing data architecture, so the idea that perhaps we should have our own data asset there, metadata tagging to make sure that all information out there around Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people is noted. Also an education and training package that could be out there as well, to ensure that people have that sort of both data literacy and cultural competence around that. And we also identified an evaluation tool. And so we end up scoring these things against a validated criteria, and the evaluation tool came up on top. And so we ended up doing this work for Lowitja Institute. And when we commenced, I guess, engagement with a range of stakeholders, and this included the Indigenous Data Sovereignty Collective as well. And we also developed this prototype. And the prototype is called the Indigenous Data Sovereignty Readiness Assessment and Evaluation Toolkit. We then pilot tested it across a few sectors. This included government, community-controlled organisation, and health research institutions, and in a couple of scenarios as well. So we had individual projects, and we also had a couple of programs in institutions that we had a look at as well. We got quite incredible and really very critical feedback before we finalised the development of the toolkit. But ultimately, it's there so that people can apply it to the work that they're doing, and have something that's a little bit, it's not overarchingly prescriptive, but something that people can guide Indigenous data sovereignty in practice for their work. And so here are the Indigenous data sovereignty components as well. And I just wanted to go through them because I think they're quite important to note. When we think about Indigenous data sovereignty, and we've been speaking about rights and information, we don't often think about it in these terms. But firstly, we've got objectives and performance, and this involves the inclusion of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander understandings and values embedded in organisational objective assessments and of performance. And this is a fundamental multi-tiered approach to position Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people within organisations to support and drive national, community and individual Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander agendas. Secondly, we found that partnerships are really important, and this can bring greater reach, depth and understanding to research projects as a component of Indigenous data sovereignty. We know that partnerships play a really large role in the ability of researchers to work across multiple organisations and engage with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, communities and their organisations as well. And so thirdly, we had data sharing and data linkage, and we've heard that data linkage can provide a wide and reach of scope here. It can enhance the quality of the data set and support community agendas and needs as well. Data types, the type of data that's collected and used to describe and tell the stories of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people is necessary to consider because it can have different impacts, and we spoke about that earlier. So of importance for Indigenous data sovereignty is how the type of data, including administrative data, survey data, discussion data, traditional knowledges, is used to tell Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander stories. Measurement issues include two primary issues. One, what is measured, and two, how it's measured. So for Indigenous data sovereignty, this addresses issues of the correct numbers of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the data, as well as identifying factors and domains that are of importance to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So just really reiterating what I've already said, but within a different framework here. Data literacy, and this is related to the capabilities of individuals and organisations to appropriately and accurately design, collect and use data pertaining to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And it is an essential consideration for individuals and communities, as well as the health research workforce particularly as well. It requires developing things like cultural safety and responsiveness or competence of individuals who design, collect and use Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander data. And then we've got centralised infrastructures, and this centralised infrastructure can provide programs and or organisations access to data collections and assets and support the collection of storage of data for the purposes of research. It's also a primary means of security and support for researchers and research organisations in the collection, storage, protection, access to data. And this may also include, and it's not limited to though, biological data banks, data platforms, cloud computing analysis facilities as well. Centralised governance processes, and these processes are essential, an essential mechanism to enact Indigenous data sovereignty principles. This includes identifying mechanisms of voice for which Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and communities lead and or contribute to in their data. Also capacity building, so building the capability of the research sector of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander data also involves, I guess, all of these mentioned components of Indigenous data sovereignty in practice. Basically, it's about growing the next generation of data nerds. And then we have self-determination, and that's front and centre with this. It's a human right, it's a central component of Indigenous data sovereignty in practice, and it's the right for all peoples to freely determine their political status and to freely pursue their economic, social and cultural developments. I guess in the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander context, self-determination is the right for all people and communities to make decisions that will ensure their social, cultural and economic needs are actually met. And so also just let everyone know that we have centralised the Mime Ngari Wangara Indigenous data sovereignty principles across all of these components as well. And this is to develop up that readiness assessment and evaluation toolkit. And I've just put this up here so that people can scan it. And you can find details about the Readiness and Assessment and Evaluation Toolkit online at the Lower Chair Institute website. And just let everyone know as well that there is an Indigenous data sovereignty discussion paper that is coming out, also commissioned by the Lower Chair Institute, that I am trying to finish by the end of this year. So please keep an eye out for it. And I think it will really assist in our understandings within this space moving forward. So just pulling together some of the things that I've mentioned here today, we'll conceptualise it through this diagram. And so the recognition of Indigenous peoples requires the acknowledgement of Indigenous peoples, and also includes how Indigenous peoples are described and defined. And this should be in alignment with the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And while I've noted that Australia does quite well relative to other nations in regards to data capture and recognition within systems, this is about data supporting our right to self-determination and community development. And community advancement, I should say, which I think really needs much more improvement in this country. We also need to talk about operations. How do we best build the capabilities of the next generation of Indigenous data nerds? And I'm not just talking about Indigenous data nerds as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander data nerds. I'm also speaking about those people who are data nerds that are working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander data as well. I would love to see a bunch of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nerds who work across all sectors, including community, governments, and know the ins and outs and ebbs and flows of working with this quite complicated national level data. We also need to recognise who is setting the priorities regarding data use. and health and wellbeing measurement to benefit the aspirations of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and communities. We always need to be asking the question, who are the we in this discussion? When it comes to population level data, who should be representing whom? I don't have the answer to that. And I think it's quite a complicated approach in terms of governance arrangements, but we do need to talk about it more, and we need to be really reflective in the way in which we address it. And finally, we need to focus on monitoring. How are we doing? Where should we be focusing our resources? To me, I see that there are still major challenges that we face in ensuring accurate and reliable official statistical reporting of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and communities. We need appropriate routine reporting that reflect our understandings and ways of knowing, being and doing, which in turn requires culturally specific data collections on those issues that matter to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And so we need to be like water and adaptable to change in the data landscape as it might arise. But we must be directing the conversation towards Indigenous data governance, and that is ensuring that there are mechanisms of voice for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and community in regards to how data is collected, used, stored, all the rest of it. We also need to recognise the work from our previous leaders in fighting for our right to be counted as well. And so we can't diminish that work. There was a lot done in the background. And to really note that if we aren't counted, then we effectively don't exist in the eyes of government. Undertaking system reform in data use and official statistics reporting, I guess, to drive equity requires us to really bust all of this open, to break down some of those silos that exist between governments, communities and organisations, and to work together. I think it also means asserting our right to lead the discussion on data and learning from our past and into our future. And I'll just finish here, but I do want to note that there are a range of challenges when it comes to data sharing capabilities across governments and other sectors. I think of particular interest and something that should be noted into the future is how communities in the community controlled sector can actually access and work with, research data, government data, community controlled organisation data to better support nation building. So that, I think, is going to be the next big pathway here. There's also a need to develop mechanisms to enable Indigenous voices to guide that decision making regarding data. There's a need for systems to support continuity of routine reporting of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander prioritised measures. And I do want to note that without these mechanisms or processes within the Australian governments, it can easily be perceived as a system that's abrogating responsibility when it comes to ensuring the rights and responsibilities of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and communities are met through that appropriate and accurate official statistics and reporting. So I'll just finish up there, but I do want to say, I do want to acknowledge some of my colleagues and partners and the groups that I work with, without whom this work would not be possible. So I'll finish there.
Thanks, Kalinda.
No worries.
A lot to think about.
Yeah,
for sure. That was great. I'm just going to stop the share and see if we have any people in the audience, physical or virtual, who have questions. We've got lots of clapping. Thank you, online clappers. Any questions?
Yep, a few are starting to come in from online. Now, Dean Smith says, thanks, the section has been fantastic. So Mark Iopolo, can you please comment on the quality of death registry data for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people? How well are the real world drivers of underreporting and misreporting understood?
There was one report that was done quite a few years ago now by the AHW. So we know that we can't use Victorian data, Tasmanian data, and ACT data for national reporting. When it comes to, I think, the work that's required, if anyone wants to do a couple of PhDs. Mortality data is probably our biggest gap, and one of our most important areas that we need to look at. And so, yeah, we don't have enough information. There has been a single report by the AHW. I'm not sure if it's publicly available, but yeah, one report. We don't have anything else. We just know that, yeah, it's Victoria, ACT, and Tas inappropriate. So I don't have the answers for you here. We don't know.
Is there another question?
That is all at this point. Yep.
Given that the 5% is what do you recommend to do by studies?
Yeah. And so this question was just around, because there are gaps in the data, how do we ensure that people who do use the data are, getting the right information from that data? This is where enhancement methods come in. And so we've got linkage. You've got quite a few different algorithm developments out there. So I think Deb Randall did a few in New South Wales. There's been, a bit of work done by the AHW, and, the ABS does quite a bit with the MADIP data as well. And so, we know that there's opportunity to enhance the data asset. And mind you, when I say ABS, MADIP, I'm talking about the utilisation of that data asset by the National Indigenous Australians Agency. And so, we know that we can enhance reporting to a pretty good estimate. And so the question is are we telling the right story when it comes to data and information? And, historically, we've always had to live with, we think it's good enough. And so we're still at that point. And for those who have been working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander data, we kind of know when it's going off on a bit of a tangent. And so, if it's the right story, if it's the right storyline, we know that's good enough. Yeah. There might be some anomalies in there, but yeah, enhancement methods is the way to go.
Got a question online from Don. I'm just going to see if I can invite you to unmute, Don.
Thanks very much. Thanks for the talk. Terrific. You've shone a really bright light on a big crack in our society. My question is about, or I'd like a comment, if you could, about how sometimes a person may acknowledge as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander and then another time not. I just know in a past role with work I did with DHHS and the Cancer Council that with linked data we could follow where a person would say they're Indigenous and then they're not. And then if you assume that person was always Indigenous after acknowledging at least once, the rates that we were working out changed quite dramatically.
Yeah. Yeah, and this is where those enhancement methods, those algorithms are really important. And different data assets require different algorithms as well. And so when we think about this as well, we're thinking about, numerator denominator bias issues. And so we kind of need to be aware of, if we've made changes, adaptations to that data, we need to be putting it in there. And again, it goes back to that, is the story the right story that we're telling?
Yep. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Don.
So we have another question from Slack. Thank you, Nadine Smith. What has been done to address trauma experienced by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders around data collected about them? We find this a challenge with Aboriginal colleagues, students, parents and communities.
Look, research has been conducted on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, often without their consent, prior to the introduction of, ethics, and even then post that as well. And with that in mind, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, including Indigenous peoples globally, are the most researched populations on Earth. And so, you know, this becomes a real challenge. There hasn't been any work that I know of. There may have been, but on the impact of that, I would be really interested. If anyone knows, please feel free to put your hand up as well. But I think it's an incredibly important question to ask. And, you know, without stepping into sort of that deficit mindset at all, what we do want to do is, you know, build relationships into the future to ensure that those data, I guess, developments are done with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, so that we can, I guess, move away from any of those potential traumas and impacts, or perpetuate any of that too.
I might go to Ian next.
Thanks, Ben, and thanks so much, Kalinda, for the talk. It was really great. I have a question. You mentioned the, I think the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare report on life expectancy. So if it's the report you're mentioning, I believe it is public. I just went to a link that found it for me anyway. And I wanted to raise the question that in that it suggests, the most recent one that I found anyway, suggests that the gap in life expectancy between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, it does it separately for men and women, and non-Indigenous men and women has reduced somewhat. And there's a suggestion that that's perhaps partially explained by the persons who have increasingly identified as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders coming from relatively privileged situations. And I wondered if you had a comment about that and the possibility that it might sort of, that lessening of the gap might sort of cause people to reduce their concern about genuine need and problems with life expectancy, continuing problems with life expectancy in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Ian. I think it's a this is a really challenging question to ask, and I think it's a challenging question to answer, in that, you know, one, around the measurement approaches to life expectancy. I'll just disclose that I am on the AHW's Indigenous statistics group as well. So I won't discuss what kind of goes into the background sort of stuff. But when it comes to, you know, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people finding out that they're Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and those people often coming from, you know, mostly major cities, colonisation worked. And so it means that, you know, we've got a lot of people missing from our communities that should be there and part of that story, that haven't engaged within those communities over that time. As we start to move forward in terms of recognising needs, you know, people who have identified later on in life or find out, you know, through, you know, some sort of online test or whatever it might be, and there needs to be a way as we move into the future, how we, I guess, engage with those communities and those people as well. And so there's a challenge here on a couple of fronts. One is around identity and where people fit within those communities, and that is quite a, I think it is quite a challenge, because, you know, people want to bring people in, but it's also, they may not have experienced those same life journeys as those who have, you know, been stolen or, you know, or come into their own cultural authority and understanding. And then the other side is around cultural authority. And this has to do with people who have found out who they are later on in life, speaking on behalf of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And so, you know, there's cultural protocol when it comes to those discussions. You know, I don't speak on behalf of anyone but my community and where I kind of fit within my family circle. And so, you know, but that is as a functional, active member of my community. And so, you know, these conversations need to be had, but they are quite challenging, and they need to be gentle as well. But I really thank you for asking that, because we don't speak about it enough, and it's not something that we should be ashamed of either. I think people really shy away from it and kind of find it a bit heavy. It's actually really important, because, again, I'll say it, colonisation worked. You know, it was about destroying people's connections, and that's exactly what happened.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ian. Cam, are there any more questions on Slack?
No, just another thanks.
All right. I might go to Shannon then, who's got their hand up.
Yeah, so I just wanted to just inquire, as a First Nations person who's worked in community-controlled organisations for the last 21 years, and I'm looking to head up our public health unit within our community and really leverage off some of those key points and, that you're saying with regards to data and data sovereignty. My question is, how do I link through to yourself? Just to start that conversation. And as a First Nations person, you've spoken about the Lower Institute and all those things. But for myself, what's a good pathway for me to start to create those conversations within our community, so then we can build our data sets and that all the items that you've spoken about today.
Yeah, thanks for that, Shannon. And depending on where you are as well, I'm happy to have a chat with you anytime. And we have a couple of people on our team that, always happy to have a bit of a chat. One of my other roles is at the VCCC Alliance, and we engage with VACHO quite routinely. We are in partnership with them, in fact, and I head up the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander program with the VCCC Alliance. But I'm happy for you to contact anytime. To start this off, it's about learning about how we put some of these conceptual terms into practice. And like I said, we have done the legwork on that. And I'm happy to forward on that readiness assessment and evaluation toolkit, and also when we do up that Indigenous data sovereignty framework as well, I'm happy to do that as well. So yeah, just please feel free to get in contact. I'm happy to share my information. We can put it in the chat if you want.
Yeah, I can send an email to all the attendees.
Yeah. If that works out okay. Was it Sharon?
I think Shannon might have muted herself again. Yeah, but yeah, thanks for that. I hope that helps. What? I have a question, and I don't know if this is necessarily a good idea, but so one of the things that you talked about was using Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander identification or self-identification in different data sets to determine sort of the truth about whether or not an individual is Aboriginal at all across those data sets. And has there been any thought about using the considering which data sets people are least likely to identify in as a way of evaluating sort of the cultural safety of those places in which that data is recorded? Yeah, there's been a little bit of work done in this. There was a report, I can't remember who wrote it, I'm so sorry. I think it was a chapter done on people identifying or being asked to identify within the justice system in Victoria. And yeah, it was quite an eye-opening piece of work. It would be really good to, I mean, that's a piece of work in itself. If we know that, people are going into a hospital and being identified, like I said, there are a couple of reasons for this. One might be, that it's a culturally safe space for people to identify. Another thing is that,
people might just be being asked a question. And so figuring out what the reason is for people not identifying is, yeah, that's the first part. And then the second part, if people aren't identifying because it's a culturally unsafe space, then, yeah, there's work to be done.
Yeah. Cool, thanks. Well, I'd like to invite everyone to thank Kalinda once again for a great talk. Some physical and virtual clapping. Thank you everybody for attending, and we'll see you at our next event.